Okay, good morning students. Today I am discussing about first year topic. So our topic name is Agents of Pollination. As per our schedule, we are going to discuss about agents of pollination. Before going to discuss about agents of pollination, we need to understand the definition of pollination. Pollination means pollen grains from the anther reach to the stigma. That process called as pollination. So pollination different types, and there are different adaptations for pollinations. So for pollination, the pollen grains from the anther transfer to the stigma. There are different agents participated. These agents are acting as carriers or vectors or vehicles. First of all, the definition of agents. What are agents? Agents are different types. They carry pollen grains from anther to the stigma. These agents are of two types. One is abiotic agents and second one is biotic agents. So with the help of these agents, plants transport pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. So this process called as pollination. So agents play a very important role for transport of agents from one place to the other place or from anther to the stigma. So let us see the different types of agents. These agents are actually two types: abiotic agents and biotic agents. So abiotic agents means, so in this pollination process, non-living organisms participate for transport pollen grains to the stigma from the anther. So non-living things, examples of non-living things, actually there are two types of non-living things which are in the form of wind and water. So wind and water, these two are very important abiotic agents. These are also called as non-living agents. So these non-living agents or abiotic agents play important role to transport pollen grains from anther to the stigma. First of all, how water participate in pollination process. So wind. First of all, wind is very important agent for transport of pollen grains to the stigma. When wind participate in pollen grains, transportation of pollen grains to the stigma, that pollination called as Animophily. Technically this term called as Animophily. So Animophily means wind current. Through wind or air, pollen grains transported or propagated from anther to the stigma. So here wind, very important agent, participated to carry pollen grains. So it is a common abiotic agent, and these pollen grains are, when pollen grains participate in pollination process, these pollen grains are structurally very smaller and light weighted, and these are also non-sticky. When they reach to the stigma, that pollen grains can also disperse. So these are non-sticky pollen grains. And when we observe the structure of stigma, when pollination takes place through the wind, they contain number of hairy and feathery like structures which traps pollen grains from the wind. So airborne pollen grains trapped by these large, longer size feathery like structures which lies with the stigma. So this is useful for trapping pollen grains. And when we observe the structure of ovule, when pollination takes place through the wind, they contain only a single ovule. So single ovulated ovary present in which where wind pollination takes place. The typical examples of wind pollination, most of the grass plants is. Most of the grass are monocotyledons. Best example, corn cob. So corn cob contain long silky hair-like structures of stigma and style. They trap pollen grains from the wind. So this is about wind pollination. So technically wind pollination also called as Animophily. Now come to the second abiotic pollination, that is water pollination. When water participate in pollination, that pollination called as water pollination, or it is also technically biologically called as hydrophily. So water current important agent for transport pollen grains from anther to the stigma, that called as hydrophily. So when we observe the hydrophily process, so water is agent. The hydrophytes which are involved in pollination mainly by water, near about 30 types of genera. So 30 types of genera or hydrophytic plants prefer hydrophily or water pollination. So most of the hydrophytic plants which are belongs to monocotyledonous plants, and hydrophilic pollination process mostly occur in lower standard plants that named as algae, bryophytes and pteridophytes, etc. So here water is very important agent for transportation of pollen grains. Best examples of hydrophily are water pollination, the hydrophytic plants like Vallisneria and Hydrilla. So Vallisneria, Hydrilla are typical examples of hydrophily. So these two types of plants which grow in fresh water. And one more type of example, Jostera. There are many types of examples are, among which typical example Vallisneria and Hydrilla. Of course, Jostera also. Jostera is a sea grass which invade over the water. So when we observe the water pollination or hydrophily, few types of plants only prefer hydrophily. Some plants which may not prefer hydrophily, even they belongs to hydrophytes. So not all plants which prefer water pollination or hydrophily. Example, water hyacinth and water lily. So these are the two plants which actually belongs to hydrophytic plants. So these plants do not prefer water pollination because the flowers of those plants which grow or emerge above the water surface levels, so that there is no chance for carry out water pollination. So in which, like water hyacinth and water lily, the pollination takes place mainly by insect and wind, even though belongs to hydrophytic plants, because the flowers are grow or emerge above the water surface level, so that water pollination not takes place in water hyacinth and water lily. These are typical examples. Those do not prefer water pollination, in which water pollination takes place by insect and wind pollination, also called as Animophily. Now come to the types of hydrophily. Based on the pollination takes place in the water, hydrophily again of two types. One is epihydrophily and the second one is hypohydrophily. One is epihydrophily, second one is hypohydrophily. What definition, what exactly meaning of epihydrophily? Epihydrophily means when we observe this diagram, this is water surface level. The stigma of the water plant which is present above the water surface. So pollen grains, these are pollen grains. These pollen grains reach to the stigma above the water surface level. So this type of pollination called as epihydrophily. Example of what epihydrophily, Vallisneria. So in which the female flower contain large size, longer style and stigma. So the stigma is above the water surface level, so that pollen grains reach to the stigma. When pollen grains reach to the stigma above the water surface level, that pollination called as epihydrophily. Best example, Vallisneria, very important. And these pollen grains which are very light weighted and passively transported through the water current. Now come to the hypohydrophily. This is second type of hydrophily pollination. So here AP means above water surface level. Hypo means below water surface level. So that pollination takes place inside of the water, because the style and stigma is suspended inside of the submerged inside of the water, so that pollen grains reach to the stigma inside water. So this type of hydrophily pollination called as hypohydrophily. Best example, Jostira. It is also called as sea grass. So in this pollination, these pollen grains structurally vary. These pollen grains are ribbon-like structures. So ribbon-like pollen grains propagated to the stigma inside of the water, so that this pollination called as hypohydrophily. So these pollen grains, actually these pollen grains present inside of the water, and these pollen grains protected by a cover. That cover is made by mucilaginous cover. So mucilage cover protected pollen grains from the wetting conditions. So when pollination takes place in water current, through water, if pollination takes place, that flowers which are colorful and they do not produce even the nectar also. So nectar not secreted by the plants which are pollinated by water, and the flowers of hydrophytic plants which are larger size and colorful flowers. Now up to now we have discussed about abiotic agents. So pollination takes place by two types actually. One is abiotic pollination, second one is biotic pollination. Abiotic means non-living organisms if participate in pollination, that called as abiotic pollination. Now come to the biotic pollination. Biotic pollination means biotic agents. Biotic agent means animals which participate in pollination process. That pollination called as biotic pollination. Otherwise technically it is also called as zoophily. So zoophily means animals participated as agents for pollination. That pollination called as zoophily. So majority of the flowering plants prefer biotic pollination or zoophily pollination process. These zoophily means different types of animals participate in pollination process. Based on the types of animals, zoophily again different types: Animophily, Ornithophily, Chiropterophily, and Therophily, Ophiophily. So let us see the first Animophily. Antimophily. Antimophily means the insects which are participate in pollination process as agents. So pollen grains reach to the stigma through the insects. When insects participated, the type of pollination or the type of zoophily called as antimophily. Best examples of insects which belongs to arthropods, bees, butterflies and flies, beetles, wasps, ants and moths. So these are the best examples which participate in pollination process. They carry pollen grains from one flower to the another flower or anther to the stigma. This type of pollination technically called as antimophily. Now come to the next type, ornithophily. Ornithophily means ornithology. Ornithology means to study about birds or aves called as ornithology. So here in this case, birds like sunbirds or hummingbirds which are propagate, transport pollen grains from one flower to the another flower. Okay, so here these are acting as agents. Through birds, pollen grains transported to the stigma from anther, that pollination called as ornithophily. And next, chiropterophily. Chiropterophily means here bats are involved in transportation of pollen grains from anther to the stigma. So here in this case, bats are not actually birds which are belongs to mammals. So bats involved in carrying pollen grains to the stigma from the anther. This type of pollination called as chiropterophily. Now come to other type of zoophily or biotic agent, that is therophily. Therophily means here in this case different type of animals like squirrels, primates and rodents etc. participated to transport pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. So if it is stigma and pollen grains propagated or transported, migrate from the anther to the stigma through squirrels or primates or rodents etc. This type of pollination called as therophily. Next, ophiophily. Ophiology means reptiles participated. To study about reptiles called as ophiology. So reptiles like gecko lizards and garden lizards, snakes, etc. These are participate pollen grains to transport pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. This pollination called as ophiophily. So these are the different types of technical terminologies which belongs to the biotic agents: antimophily, ornithophily, chiropterophily, therophily, ophiology and melacophily. Melacophily means through the molluscans, if pollen grains transport to the stigma, that pollination called as melacophily. So majority of the flowers which prefer pollination through the insects, because insects are large quantity organisms which belongs to arthropods involved in pollination process. So that those plants which are prefer pollination by insects, that plants contain large colorful flowers and they also produce fragrance, and they also releases are that flowers which are very rich in nectar. And when pollination takes place by flies or beetles, these flowers which are produce foul odor means bad smell produced from the flowers when they pollinated through flies and beetles. So these are the different types of biotic agents involved in pollination process, and some insects which are very important for pollination in different type of flowers, and the flowers which provide a safe place for the laying down of eggs by insects. Example, Amorphophilus. Amorphophilus inflorescence. It is a different type of inflorescence which provide for the safe place laying down the insects by the insects. And there are close relationship between moth also type of insect, and yucca. So moth scientific name is Tegitacula yuccacella. So this type of insect, moth, which complete their life cycle with the help of yucca. So these are the different types of adaptations we observe in different flowering plants. Okay boys, thank you very much.